Well, thank you very much, Alex. I really appreciate that nice introduction. I actually sent him a lot more information about myself. We'll let him come back later and tell you the rest of the story, just in all humility. No, it's really nice to be here. And I want to thank Alex and Ahimsa and also my colleagues. Alex mentioned our colleagues here. Gopalasamy Ruben Clements, who as he mentioned, is a former PhD student here and who's been very active here in Peninsular Malaysia in research for a long time. And then Dr. Mason Campbell, Dr. Mohammed Alamgir, who are part of this research team that we'll be talking about right now. And so thanks to everyone who's been involved in organizing this. We're here to talk about infrastructure, and I think you probably, most of you, if you picked up a newspaper, if you watch television, you hear about infrastructure, you hear about roads, railroads, hydroelectric dams, mining projects, petroleum, fossil fuel projects. You just hear about infrastructure all the time, and it really is one of the biggest issues that's happening right now in the world. Current projections suggest that there's going to be something like 25 million kilometers of new paved roads by the middle part of this century, and that's enough to encircle the world more than 600 times. And it pretty much, any other kinds of infrastructure that you look at, for instance, there's close to 4,000 major hydroelectric dams that are being constructed in different parts of the world right now. And you can, add everything else, power lines, gas lines, timber projects, mining projects, all these different kinds of developments are happening pretty much everywhere you look, but especially in the developing world, in the developing nations, of course, which are developing economies and need development, social and economic development. But about 9/10 of all of these new projects are happening now in the developing world. And it's, in some ways, it's almost a tsunami of what's happening because we're seeing such rapid change. And one of the big questions is how is this change going to be managed? And what are going to be the environmental, not just the environmental, but also we'll talk a little more broadly about the social and economic and political impacts of all this kind of stuff. But just to give you an idea of how big this wave of change is, the G20 nations, the world's 20 biggest economies, when they met a couple years ago, they estimated that there needed to be between 60 and 70 trillion dollars of additional investment in new infrastructure projects by 2030. That's not very far away. That would double, more than double, the total investment in all infrastructure across the planet. I mean, we're talking about doubling everything. Think about all the roads, all the dams, all the power lines, all the gas lines, with most of that happening in the developing world, which contain many of the world's most biologically rich and environmentally critical ecosystems on the planet. So the implications for nature and for natural ecosystems, and really more broadly for human environments, are really critical. Alex kindly mentioned ALERT, this group that we started up here. We started ALERT in 2013, and we found there was an interest in this, so we put out these. If you're not a member of ALERT, first thing you do, write down on your hand right now, www.alert.conservation.com. Go home and sign up for this, because you'll just get about one of these things a week, but we provide kind of a synthesis. And there is a lot of stuff that's about the Asia-Pacific region, but lots of things around the tropics, around developing countries, around a whole range of issues, global warming. And for instance, there's one that we had here. They're little, short, easy-to-read syntheses. They're not just about you might read something in a newspaper and it'll be about one story. What we try to do is integrate and pull that together into a variety of stories, and it's going pretty fast. We started up ALERT after having spent about 20 years working with different scientific organizations trying to get them more engaged in what you might call real-world conservation. And as much goodwill as there was in the scientific organizations, they're just not used to operating as quickly as real-world conservation. You hear, bang, the Prime Minister is going to decide about this big project in 2 weeks. And a scientific organization is just not set up to react that way, whereas ALERT is. And we can literally get something out in a few hours. And sometimes we have everything lined up, then all of a sudden an urgent issue comes in. Many times I've stayed up 2, 3 o'clock in the morning writing some blog because it was some critical issue that's just about to come out. We have been, we're working now in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Papua New Guinea, and we're also doing some work in Africa on infrastructure projects. We have quite a large project now in this Asia-Pacific region, these 3 mega biodiversity countries. And so what we're doing at the moment is coming and talking and particularly listening and learning, because we know that every country's got a lot of complexity and many levels of government and many different projects planned, and what we're trying to do is to engage and to collaborate with people who are interested in these issues. So one of the things that we've been quite fortunate with is we've been getting our foot in the door with some of the higher levels of government. We're also spending a lot of time talking with NGOs, with people in academia, all different walks of life. So for instance, this is a meeting we were at in Banda Aceh, which is in northern Sumatra, Indonesia, which is a critical area, environmental area there. This is in Bogor in Java. This is in Kalimantan. We've got a team of our guys are going to be going to Kalimantan shortly on this same trip. We were able to brief some of the top advisors in the Indonesian president's office. Also, we spent 3 hours with the top, the Minister for Environment and Forestry in Indonesia, and we had a lot of good interactions with her. This is with the UK Overseas Development. This is just with some local folks in Papua, Indonesian Papua. And just a couple days ago, we were very fortunate to visit the Prime Minister's department and talk to the Director of Infrastructure there and his team in KL. And they were really receptive. We just found them very, very open-minded and interested. So it speaks very well to, we're very happy to have this level engagement happening initially. It's just very early days, but we're really happy to have these some important doors being opened right away. No matter how you look at it, the area where you guys live right now is among the most critically imperiled and also critically important regions on the planet. This is an analysis that we did looking at what we call the vulnerability, overall vulnerability of different kinds of regions in the world. And tropical islands and peninsulas, which really is mostly Southeast Asia, came out. The lower you actually have the score here, the higher your vulnerability. This area, this Southeast Asian area, comes out as just super important. Super important because it's got this extremely, as high a biological richness as any place on the planet, and also very intensive changes that have happened in the past and that are happening right now. And I'm sure if you just see, for instance, a forest cover map of Peninsular Malaysia, you'll see that there's been, in the last 3 or 4 decades, dramatic reduction and contraction of the forests here. Still substantial areas of forest left, but a lot has disappeared as well. So some of the environments that you know about here, lowland rainforests, of course, are very widely distributed. Montane rainforests, in many cases having, very, very high diversity and endemism, almost all these environments. Peat forests and mangroves. I'm sure you all know about the haze issues, which have been a chronic problem in Southeast Asia because of the large-scale peat fires that are burning, in some cases burning very, very intensively for months and months in some of these peat areas, coastal areas. You've got also not just the richest forest ecosystems on the planet, but probably also the richest coral reef ecosystems. So again, this area is part of what they call the Coral Triangle, and really it centers right around Southeast Asia. It goes from the Philippines, across Malaysia, down through sort of the corner of Borneo and New Guinea. That is recognized by coral biologists or by marine biologists as the richest marine ecosystems on the planet. Oh, and then just a little bit about the kinds of land uses here. Well, you all know this stuff. Traditional slash and burn farming or swidden farming is a very prevalent land use in many areas. Industrial logging, of course, has been an enormous issue. The forests here have a lot of valuable timber, or I should say they did, because a lot of those timber stocks have been harvested now. But because of the dipterocarp trees, what some people call the Meranti trees, they're very good timber trees. They're large, they're tall, some of them up to more than 80 meters tall, and many of them have really good wood properties. So the value of the forest for timber has been extremely high, and we've seen a lot of logging activity in Southeast Asia. Now what we're seeing is many forests being logged second time, third time, and then a key question becomes, what's going to happen to those logged forests? Will they keep them, retain them as native forests? Which we know, even though they've been logged multiple times, they still have far more biodiversity, much more biodiversity, and also good carbon storage and good hydrological functioning. But compared to something like an oil palm plantation or a rubber plantation or something else that's an exotic species, the log forests are incredibly valuable. So actually, one of the key things now in this part of the world, it's not just about protecting the protected areas, there's a real need for that because there's a lot of poaching and other threats going on, but it's also about trying to convince people that these log forests are actually really valuable, because they are. They're as different as night and day from something like a monoculture of rubber or some kind of other, or oil palm or acacia, which would be grown for wood pulp, something like that. And mentioning that, of course, there's a lot of industrial, this is obviously the epicenter of oil palm production within Indonesia and Malaysia here, and a lot of habitats are being destroyed and have been destroyed as a result of that. We could talk about this at length, but you know, there's been a lot of progress made in terms of large oil palm and wood pulp corporations committing to try to reduce the amount of deforestation associated with their production. And actually, Indonesia and Malaysia have now joined together to try to destroy that initiative. They're trying to basically ruin that program because they don't want, they're unhappy about that happening. So that's an important political thing that's going on right now, where they're essentially trying to subvert the no deforestation agreements made by large oil palm and wood pulp corporations because, well, they have ambitious plans for continued large-scale conversion of forest into oil palm. So that's something I don't know how much gets discussed here, but it's a very big issue. Mining, of course, is a huge issue here. You can see, this is, well, for Indonesia, but you can see the large areas that are within different kinds of mineral and oil gas leases. This is in central Kalimantan. These are illegal gold miners here. This is in New Guinea's Freeport mine. But you can see there's a lot of impacts associated with mining and also impacts associated with the roads and the infrastructure. Very oftentimes people will talk about these projects like, you know, a hydroelectric dam or a mining project or something like that, and they'll be very concerned about the impacts of the project itself. We actually find in many cases, and I'll come back and talk about this more, it's the roads and the power lines or the railroads or the other infrastructure associated with that project that's actually more dangerous than the project itself, what we call the anchoring project. So we'll come back and talk about that a bit more, but it is something that we talk about a lot. One of the reasons that these things are dangerous is that roads and other things facilitate a lot of poaching activities. There's a very active market for wildlife and wildlife products, as you know, in the Asia Pacific. China, Vietnam, and particularly China has been a massive market for a lot of this, and you see a lot of activities such as poaching. This is, I believe, if I recall right, that's a tiger that was poached, snared in Peninsular Malaysia. I believe that's an elephant that was killed in Sabah, if I remember right. Can't remember where that photo was taken. This is a loris, which was part of a trade. I think this is actually in KL. But the bottom line is this is another serious threat. Now, what I want to do is talk, I'm just going to say a little bit about the social and economic issues here. I don't want to just focus on the environment, because if we just talk about the environment, we actually find that there's a relatively narrow, although conscientious, but narrow subset of the public that's really galvanized by these issues. In fact, these projects have much wider impacts than many people realize. And so what I want to talk about here is a little bit about the rewards and the risks associated with big projects, big investments, this kind of thing that we see happening very much in many developing nations. And a lot of times what these large projects are associated with is major foreign investments. Sometimes the projects are actually funded with domestic funding, from government funding, but in many cases they're associated with some kind of corporation, or in many cases, for instance, with China. You might have a Chinese corporation. China is overwhelmingly the biggest funder right now of large-scale infrastructure projects. So it might be a Chinese publicly held corporation, what they call a public-private partnership, or they may be private corporations, or they might be corporations from Europe or from North America or Australia or Japan, whatever. But they can come from a whole variety, or you know, possibly Indonesia, Singapore, etc. But what we see very often is you get these large projects, and I'm just going to use an example as a big mining project, could be a big timber project, a big oil and gas project, whatever. But what can happen to economies, developing economies, when you get this kind of thing happening? There's obviously potential for capturing significant rewards. Let's say you're going to have a world-scale iron project or copper ore project. There's a potential for the government to capture considerable taxes and royalties from that. So there's a very obvious positive advantage there. Oftentimes these development projects, and particularly the ones that China's engaged in now, will be associated with major infrastructure. Usually what's going on is that what they're trying to do is to get the, say, iron ore or copper ore or coal or whatever from the mine to a port so it can then be exported, principally the Chinese markets, for instance. And so there will be a large project linking that, that anchor project to a coastal port. But that, those infrastructure investments can be important for development. And also, we will oftentimes see mitigation funds, particularly if the governments have strong safeguards. They will oftentimes require that overseas investor to put money into some conservation. So for instance, I was just in Central Africa, in Cameroon and in Congo, and we drove through a reserve that was 156,000 hectares in area. And around that reserve, before we got to the reserve, we were not seeing any animals. We weren't seeing any wildlife or anything. And we got into the reserve and suddenly started seeing elephants and chiracos and hornbills and lots of animals there. And the reason that 156,000 hectare reserve got set up was that China built a large hydroelectric dam project there. And the government insisted that China put some funding into setting up this reserve. So there was an obvious example where conservation benefited from one of these large-scale infrastructure projects. Now, the project also flooded a large area forest, and they also built roads and power lines out to that project, and there's actually been a lot of colonization of the forest associated with that. So it's a significant environmental impact, but at least we're seeing an environmental benefit that's being associated with that project. So that's a positive. So there's no way to talk about these things in black and white terms. They have costs and they have benefits, and that's what we want to do, is talk about these things realistically. Now, there are also, of course, risks associated with these large-scale developments. I think we all know about the environmental risks, although many people, I think, perhaps focus too much on the direct impact of the project itself. So, for instance, if it's a large-scale open coal mine, they'll be very concerned about the mine. They might be worried about how that mine might have impacts on streams and rivers from runoff, that type of thing. But oftentimes what they don't actually realize is that it's the roads or the railroads and the other kinds of infrastructure that are associated with that that actually create a whole corridor of habitat disruption, because those roads and those projects can actually open up a whole Pandora's box of illegal land robbing, illegal logging, illegal poaching activity, illegal gold mining, all kinds of basically circumstances in which governments are being defrauded of royalties and of the rents and the kinds of taxes that they normally incur. So you're basically, the public is being defrauded. You're getting, in many cases, sort of out of control environmental things. In some cases, there can be illegal drug production associated as well. So the bottom line is, you can get environmental risks that are sometimes over a much larger scale than many people would realize when you get a big project happening. You can sometimes get encroachment into protected areas. If, for instance, if that road goes near a protected area, I was just in Africa, and in one of the best protected areas in the Congo Basin, and they had just put in a major road, a logging road, and all of a sudden the people in the park were finding all these poachers coming up and killing elephants and gorillas. And we in fact found in the park an elephant that had been slaughtered, and it had its face hacked off. And that's how you know the poachers have done it, because they hack off the face so they can get the tusks, the base of the tusks as well. So they're only killing the elephant to get the ivory tusks, which are valuable. So you get environmental risk. However, this is the part that doesn't get talked about nearly enough, is the social and the economic risks that can be associated with these kinds of projects. If you think about this, imagine you've got a large-scale infrastructure project, a relatively modest-sized economy. This applies to a degree to a country like Malaysia, but your economy here is fairly substantial now. But still, when you suddenly get an influx of foreign revenues associated with some kind of large-scale natural development project, when you get this large-scale movement of currency coming in, typically what this will be associated with is a rise in the currency. So the value of the ringgit, for instance, actually inflates. And what that does, it actually has very profound impacts on the economy. If we think of a healthy economy as being like a table, and a stable table would have a variety of pillars that would be supporting it. So you might have the mining sector of the economy, but you would also have agricultural exports, you would have manufacturing, you would have education, you would have tourism, you'd have goods and services, you'd have a whole different sectors of that economy that are being supported, and so that table is quite stable. Well, what happens when you get large-scale foreign inputs into the economy, particularly focusing on one sector? What happens is that one sector, say mining, becomes much larger, but because the currency gets more valuable, because the currency appreciates in value, almost all the other sectors of the economy suffer. Because it becomes more expensive, your agricultural exports and any manufacturing exports become less competitive because the value of the currency is higher. Anything that involves people coming into the country, such as tourism, such as education, those suffer. And what you see, in fact, is that the best governed countries in the world, and one example would be my country, Australia, are absolutely struggling with these issues. We had a prime minister, Kevin Rudd, who was thrown out of office by the big mining companies because they became very unhappy with him. He tried to bring in some taxation on their, what he called their super profits, okay, because they were making incredible profits. They threw him out of office, okay? And there was a new prime minister brought in, and that prime minister, first thing she said was, we're not going to touch the mining companies. They get to do whatever they want to do, okay? They literally deposed a government, okay? That's how powerful an economic force they can become. So what happens is, if you imagine, because you've got all these shrinking pillars of the economy, and this one pillar of the economy becomes large, the table becomes less stable. The economy becomes more reliant on one or a small number of resources, and then what happens? We see this happening every day. Commodity prices go up and down, up and down. You get these shocks happening. I mean, I know this is happening in Malaysia right now because I know the ringgit's come down because you've got substantial oil and gas exports. Almost every country in the world now that's relying on oil and gas exports is suffering because there's a glut right now in oil and gas production. The other thing you can see happening sometimes is that there will be basically a boom and a bust. A good example of this is the Solomon Islands. Solomon Islands, something like 70% of their export income has been coming from timber exports, mostly going to China. Well, they've overlogged the forest. They've overharvested, and now they're running out of basically any forest, virtually any forest that's been accessible has been logged 2 or 3 times. So they're running out of timber. The timber market is collapsing, and suddenly 70% of their export income is imperiled. And they don't have any sort of obvious anything to take its place. So this can destabilize because of boom and bust and because of shocks associated with these large influxes of foreign capital and the changes that they make in the economy. These can actually have destabilizing impacts on economies. Another thing that people tend to think about, you know when somebody shows up with an idea for a project and it's almost like they're smiling and they're waving money and they're like, hey, you know what? We're going to build this giant dam. It's going to be great. There's going to be a lot of jobs. We're going to have a lot of money. But in fact, if we think of the economy as being, or the people in the country and in an economy being a bunch of little boats floating on the water, what you'd like to think is when you've got the investments happening is that all the little boats kind of rise together. And in fact, that almost never happens. When you get these big investments happening, in fact, what you see, and again, almost every country in the world, it happens. Certain individuals are in very politically powerful positions, or they're very connected in different ways, and they tend to be very, very effective, they and oftentimes it's their associates, at capturing very large amounts of those investments that are coming in, and a lot of those investments do not get equitably distributed. Again, even the best governed countries in the world are really struggling with these issues. Certain people become incredibly enriched, but in fact, the benefits are very, very rarely, in fact, they're never evenly distributed. In fact, what oftentimes happens is that the poorer people, and the people down at the poverty line or below the poverty line, they in fact, they don't even go forward, they actually go backward. Because what happens is, you get more inflation. You get money coming into the economy, and the wealthier people are going out and they're spending and they're buying. So inflation happens, and so the cost of food increases, the cost of living, rent increases, everything associated with living increases, and the people down here, the large sector of the economy that's not gaining from that major investment, they're actually suffering because their living costs are increasing, but they're not getting any more income. So in fact, we tend to think of these big investments and these big capital projects, foreign funded projects, as being good for the economy and good for the majority of people, but in reality, oftentimes they can actually be destabilizing economically and destabilizing socially, because the benefits, again, even in the best governed countries in the world, are almost never even. And in fact, there's an index, this famous thing called the Gini index, which measures economic disparity. It's positively correlated with foreign investments. The more foreign investment you have coming in, the more unequal your economy becomes. It's almost, you get wealth and you tend to get more disparity. So this is one of the things that just gets swept under the carpet, and you don't hear people talking about it enough. There are really serious risks associated with these large-scale projects and large-scale foreign investments, and they are not environmental. they're social and they're economic. They affect everybody. They're not just affecting, you know, elephants or something else that we might care about. It affects everyone. So not saying infrastructure is bad, not saying all infrastructure is a bad idea. What we're saying is it's important to have these conversations and to have realistic expectations, and for the governments to be open with the public about what's likely to happen, and for the governments to have a clear understanding, because then they can try to have safeguards in place, or they can maybe think carefully about which projects they want to support. So what I want to do now from an environmental scientist point of view is talk a bit about roads and what roads do. We've been studying roads in various ways for a long time, including Ruben here and other guys, people associated with our group. We've been working in the Amazon, we worked in Africa, we worked a lot here in the Asia Pacific region. But one of the things that obviously happens when you build a road is that you get habitat loss, so we all know that. You come in with a bulldozer, you tend to cut off the high parts of the train, and you tend to push that into the low parts of the train to kind of level things out, so you have this sort of cut and fill operation. And this is a road associated with a gold mine in Panama, and that's a few dozen meters across there. So we've got some habitat loss associated with that road. In the tropics, one of the things that we see, especially in the tropics, but any kind of environment, but especially here, is these rainforests are millions and millions of years old. And they're very, very environmentally specialized. They are very cool. They have a cool environment. It's moist, very humid, very dark, stable temperatures, very little wind. And because those environments have existed for many tens of millions of years, a lot of the species living in those environments are ecologically and behaviorally and physiologically specialized for those very unique microclimates and types of forests. And suddenly you put a road through there, which is hot and dry and completely physically different, and you get this very strong juxtaposition of two completely different kinds of environments. And as a result of that, what you get is all these so-called edge effects. So these are edge effects that we've measured in the Amazon. This would be the road right here, and this would be hundreds of meters penetrating into the forest. And you can see there's a whole set of different kinds of microclimatic and physical and biological changes that are associated with those very abrupt artificial edges of the roads that are associated with clearings or with road clearings. So there's a lot of environmental changes that go beyond, like a halo, spreading out from the road itself. Here's some example from some of my wife's PhD work with birds in the Amazon. These are some groups of birds here. This is the abundance of birds. So here's our road right here, and these are just little forest roads. They're only about 30 meters wide, very little traffic. This is 10 meters from the road, 70 meters from the road, 130 meters from the road, and they set up little net lines, mist net lines, and you can see here, as these birds get closer and closer to the roads, they just decline in abundance. They don't like roads. They don't even want to be associated with them. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe it's because they've got great big eyes and they're adapted for dark conditions. Maybe the road seems foreign, exotic, frightening. We don't know why, but they just, in many cases, they just don't like to go near the roads. They really seem to avoid them. So there's a strong pattern of road avoidance. Another common thing is hydrological impacts. One of the biggest things that confounds roads in the tropics is water. Either in an area where there's flooding and inundation or where there's inadequate drainage. And you know what happens in the tropics is you get certain times of the year where you get a huge amount of rain that might be falling just within a week. And unless you have a lot of investment in a road base and in culverts and in drainage underneath the road, what you'll inevitably get will be flooding, and that'll kill trees and kill vegetation, so that'll have an impact as well as the road base itself. Also, what you'll oftentimes get with road activity is erosion and stream sedimentation. You know, the quality of water coming out of rainforest streams is incredibly high. The rainforest vegetation holds onto the soil, it holds onto the nutrients, and basically it's very pure water coming out of rainforests. Typically, just with an industrial logging operation, it's not clearing the forest, but just selective logging, what you'll get is about 10,000 times more sediments, in rough figures, in the streams for the first year after the logging operation. It's about 10,000 times more. So you're going from a very clean stream to one where you're suddenly getting much, much more silt, which impact on fisheries and on aquatic wildlife and on communities which rely on those fisheries, that type of thing. So that's another consequence of road building. Roadkill, of course, this is actually from Peninsular Malaysia. In fact, this is two. Roadkill is an obvious thing that we know happens. We saw some work from Meme, very interesting work, where they had one of their elephants that had a collision with a vehicle. The elephant survived, but it was damaged fairly heavily by the collision. But there's certain kind of species that are more vulnerable than others, things that tend to forage along roads, things that tend to be large, and sometimes they freeze in response to vehicles. And this mortality turns out can be quite an important source of reducing their population's viability. One of the things that many people are surprised to hear is that roads can actually act as complete barriers, can actually stop the movements of some species. This again has worked for my wife's PhD. Now in the Amazon, there are certain kinds of birds that mate for their entire life with an individual. It's like marrying a husband or marrying a wife and spending your whole life with them. They mate permanently and they only have one mate. And they spend their whole lives on one territory. They don't migrate, they don't move anywhere, they stick that whole life on that territory. You can actually take one of those birds and you can catch one with a mist net, put a radio collar on it, and you can move it inside the rainforest 2 or 3 kilometers away from its territory, and it will be back to its territory usually within the same day, if not the same day, within the next day. They show an incredible capacity to get home. But you take that same bird and you move it across a highway clearing, which is 60 to 100 meters wide, and the birds will go up and down the edges of that road, and they will not go back, okay? Now you can imagine a more powerful motivation for a species to try to get back to its lifetime mate and its permanent territory, and yet they don't go back. So this just shows you how powerful the behavioral avoidance they have of these clearings, which are obviously foreign and exotic to them in any time in their evolutionary history. So, you know, when you're getting that kind of fragmentation of populations, you really can be having some important effects. We also know that these corridors can be important invasions for exotic species. So, for instance, studies in Latin America show that you typically get something like 600 times more malaria-carrying mosquitoes in cleared areas, including road verges, than you do inside the rainforest itself. Okay, so you get a lot more of disease activity. These are little fire ants. These are nasty little ants. You run into, whenever you're in a place like Africa, these are actually native to Argentina. They're spreading all over the world now. They love roads. Whenever you hit an old logging road in Africa, all of a sudden you'll get stung and burned, and it'll be, you realize you're on an old logging road because you're suddenly getting hit by these ants. Somebody published a paper where they found a leopard that was dying, and the ants tend to go for the eyes, and it had been stung in the eyes and blinded, and it was starving to death. This is the cane toad, which is one of these horrible things that's invading Australia. It has these big poisonous glands here. If anything tries to eat it, it dies almost immediately. So as the cane toads are spreading, and they love to move along roads in rainforest environments, we see things like the native marsupials and the big lizards and the pythons and all these things dying as they try to eat these toads. Anyway, this is an invading vine species here. I only show this one because this is a house. This is one of these things that grow really fast. So this is a tree that's engulfed. This is a house. If you park your car near this kudzu vine, within a week it will overgrow the car. So some of these things are very aggressive invaders. Now, what we've just talked about are direct effects of road building activity or railroads or any other kind of linear clearing. But in fact, some of the worst of consequences are not a direct result, but they're an indirect result. They don't happen directly, but as an indirect consequence. So for instance, one of the obvious things is we get big incursions of hunters when we put a road in. This is in Central Africa. This is in Gabon. This is an elephant that we found that had a bullet hole in the back of the head, and clearly it escaped from the poachers that were trying to kill it because it still had its ivory tusks, so it must have gotten away and then died inside the forest. But that's what's happened with a lot of forest elephants, is they're being poached for their ivory tusks. And you see, associated with these roads, big increases. The hunters now, there's many more roads in the tropics, and they also have much more lethal technologies. They've got snares and cables, which are, they used to use vines and native things, but now they have these cheap, very readily available things like wire and cable, and they've got rifles, in many cases automatic rifles. So really nothing, and much more lethal technologies. Snares, as I mentioned here, this is just from snares that were cleared from one area of a park in Cambodia. Chimpanzee that flossed his arm. This was a tiger that Ruben, was this one that you took? Is this the animal that you guys tried to save? And so this is in northern peninsula in Malaysia here. This was an animal that was snared by poachers, and they tried to save the animal, WWF did, and it died. So they made a very strong effort to try to do this. There's some amazing video footage of this stuff. And then you have another one. What's the name of the one that the tiger that lost its leg?
No, it's not public. It's not online.
Oh, sorry, that's not public. Okay, sorry. Sorry, I get mixed up. I thought that one was online, so I apologize. Okay, well, then I'll just forget you heard about that one. Okay, forget you heard about the three-legged tiger. Just remove that from your mind right now. Okay, so these road impacts can be very important. This is from Africa. This is what we have here is a major highway. This is all across central equatorial Africa. Here's a major highway, and this is moving up to 60 kilometers away from the highway. As we get closer and closer to the highway, what you can see is a big increase in human signs, particularly hunting activity. So this would be snares, shotgun shells, hunting camps, other kinds of obvious signs of human activity. This is the abundance of forest elephants. Up here, very abundant, but as you get closer and closer to the roads, you can see how dramatically their populations are falling. So there really does seem to be a strong effect, a large-scale effect of this hunting activity associated with roads, at least in equatorial Africa. Now remember, all of this is pretty much forested here. But what we're seeing here in green is actually, and this is analysis done 10 years ago, what we're seeing here in green is the area of safe refugia for forest elephants in equatorial Africa as a result of all the road building activity. And you can see there's not very many safe places for them left. That was 10 years ago. Since then, there's been a lot of additional roads built. The global population of the forest elephant has fallen by about 2/3 in the last 10 years. And it's because of the roads and all the hunters coming in with the snares and the automatic rifles. And this is what we're seeing. And basically, it's been high demand, especially from China and Vietnam, which has been fueling this for the ivory. China is just in the process now, at least in theory, of banning the open sale, the public sale of ivory. So hopefully that will help. But we have seen an epic slaughter of forest elephants driven by roads. And the poachers are not just taking elephants. They shoot pretty much anything they can. Anything they can sell for bush meat or whatever, they'll be going after. Illegal gold mining is a very important consequence of roads. Seeing illegal gold mining everywhere in the tropical world. The miners come in, oftentimes associated with roads. One of the actual, even though they have big impacts on the riparian zones and on aquatic species and on the water quality, they actually have huge human impacts, because what you see is villages have established alongside streams and rivers. And they've lived there many generations, okay? And they've got the traditional place. They bathe in the river. They drink the water. They wash in the river. They fish in the river. Everything comes out of that river. They don't get in a car. They don't have plumbing carrying in water. They don't get into a car to go get water. That's where they live. It's where the children drink. It's where everybody eats. And then suddenly you're getting all this siltation, which has a big impact on the fisheries, and all the heavy metals, particularly mercury, coming down, the cadmium and other kinds of toxic metals, lead, coming down in these heavily disturbed streams and rivers. And so this has a big social impact. This has a major, in fact, the study's showing that there's been large neurological impacts, particularly for the children, because of eating so much mercury-contaminated fish in their diets. We know loggers both build roads and they both use roads, so this has been a major driver of road construction and road building in the tropics. And we know that roads are strongly associated with fires. So here's an example from Bolivia here. These areas here are major logging roads in northern Bolivia. These areas in red are major forest fires. And you don't have to look at that very long to see there's a very strong correlation between where the roads are and where the fires are. Okay, so roads hugely increase fire frequency. And finally, roads, if you want to say where is deforestation going to happen, or where has deforestation happened in the past, just map the roads. Okay, this is something that we found. We did an analysis originally in 2002, and we looked at the relationship between, this is in the Amazon, the relationship between deforestation and the distances away from roads. And these were just legal roads. And you can see here a large concentration of deforestation as you're getting within a couple hundred kilometers of these highways. What we then did later is we said, look, we know that there's a lot of roads out there that are just not in any map. They're not mapped by the governments. And so what we actually did was very carefully map all the illegal roads as well as the legal roads. And we found that for every 1 kilometer of legal road, there was almost 3 kilometers of illegal roads. Okay, so almost 3 to 1. That's probably more or less typical of a lot of developing countries. Once we mapped all the roads, including the illegal roads, we found that 95% of all deforestation in the Amazon occurs within 5.5 kilometers of a legal or illegal road. Okay, 95% of all the deforestation is occurring within 3 miles of a legal or illegal road. Right? If you want to know where the deforestation is or where it's going to happen, just say, and you want to know where future deforestation is going to happen, just say where the road's going to go. Where the railroads, where the roads, where the power lines, where all these linear clearings are going to go, because that is overwhelmingly the most important determinant of the pattern and pace of forest destruction and impacts on wildlife. So there's a reason why we're focusing on infrastructure and on roads so much, because they are having truly transformative impacts on environments and on societies and economies, and especially in the developing world. And there's so many different infrastructure projects being planned and proposed right now that one of the things that we're trying to say is, well, are all these desirable? You know, are they all equally desirable? Governments don't have the capacity to fund everything they want to fund anyway. So really there needs to be a prioritization about which ones are going to deliver the best benefits, and also they're going to hopefully have the smallest environmental costs, or the smallest other kinds of costs. So we're looking at environmental values, economic and social benefits, and also things like protected areas and rare species. So that's what we're going to talk about now for just a little bit. So we've been talking about this for a number of years. One of the things that we found is that when you look at the way countries evaluate, let's say for instance a big development project like a big highway, what they almost always do is they do this. They say, we're going to do an environmental impact assessment. And what they do is they tell the company that's doing the environmental impact assessment, usually what's called the terms of reference, and they say your terms of reference are the highway, and it might be 50 meters on either side of the highway. Okay? That is what the people doing the environmental impact assessment are oftentimes charged with evaluating. And so that's all they focus on. They say, okay, we're just going to look at that little narrow strip right there. And even like in Brazil, this is true. This is built into some of the environmental impact assessment guidelines. If you're driving your bulldozer along and you happen to have an endangered species in front of the bulldozer, well, you should get out of the bulldozer and you should go pick up the endangered species and pick it up and move it off to the side, put it down, and then just keep on with your bulldozer. Okay? This is one of the mitigation measures that's being put in here. This is ignoring this Pandora's box of illegal hunting and deforestation and fires and land speculation and land colonization. It's pretending all that stuff isn't going to happen. Well, that environmental impact assessment is completely inadequate, and yet that's what we see happening again, and even in the leading industrial countries. So the environmental impact assessment process is seriously flawed in many cases because they're not looking at the indirect effects. They're not looking at all the other things that can be induced by the development. And so what we're really arguing is that we need to be much more proactive, much more systematic in how we're trying to look at roads and road projects. So the basic scheme that we're developing here is it's quite simple actually, and it's just got 2 basic goals. The first goal is to say, look, where do we ideally not want to put roads? Okay? Where do we want to avoid when we're building roads? And here's an example. This is the Brazilian Amazon right here. This is the first highway that was built through the Brazilian Amazon. It goes between Belém at the mouth of the Amazon down to the national capital. I think this is 1,500 or 2,000 kilometers long. When it was first built in the 1970s, it was pretty much just a razor-thin cut through the forest. It was just a road. Today, if you drive along that, what you see is there's this whole spider web of secondary and tertiary roads coming off that, and that is roughly a 400-kilometer wide slash of forest destruction across the eastern Brazilian Amazon. You can drive that road and you don't hardly see any forest at all, just little tiny patches here and little tufts of trees there, and almost all the forest has been destroyed. Okay? That would be an example of a road that really, from an environmental perspective, we wouldn't like to see. One of the key conclusions that we've drawn is that if you've got a place that's forested, that's wild, that's a protected area, that's got an intact ecosystem, those are the places, if you can possibly avoid, don't put the roads in there. Don't even put the first road in. Avoid that first cut if you can possibly do it. Because the analogy that we actually use is this: roads are a lot like cancer, okay? Because if you look at deforestation on a large global scale, what you'll see is deforestation is very, very spatially contagious. It tends to grow like a tumor away from areas where you've got prior deforestation or prior physical access. So when you put in a road into a forest, what you tend to see is that deforestation tends to spread like a series of tumors along that road. And then what happens? Then you start getting secondary roads and tertiary roads coming off that, and the cancer spreads. The deforestation spreads over here, and it spreads over here, spreads over here, and it behaves just like a cancer. Here's the thing. If you've got cancer, there's no such thing as having a little bit of cancer. You know, if you got cancer, you got cancer. All right, it's just, you know, you're not going to fight it with a Band-Aid. So basically, you got two options if you got cancer. Option number one is you can try to cut the cancer out. Right, you can have surgery, and that would be analogous. Let's say you're going to go in and log that forest. That would be analogous then to going in and completely physically closing that road. So somehow you're going to close that road so that people can't get in later on. So that would be the equivalent of surgically removing the cancer. The other thing you can do is we can say, well, I can't remove it surgically, but I can treat it with radiation and with chemotherapy. And that's possible, but it's expensive and it's painful and it's a long-term process and, you know, it's expensive. So the analogy here would be, okay, the government's going to maintain that road, but unless they don't want a lot of frontier chaos to happen, a lot of environmental destruction and degradation and theft to happen, theft of illegal resources, timber, mining resources, all kinds of things. If they don't want that to happen, they've got to control the frontier. They've got to control all of that activity. They've got to monitor. They've got to have enforcement. They've got to have laws. They've got to have an effective judiciary. They've got to basically be able to control any of the corruption and graft that's going on. They've got to have basically a permanent investment in maintaining and monitoring that area as forest, or it will no longer be forest. It'll get converted into something else in all likelihood. So those are the options that happen really when you put a road into a wild place, is that this dynamic happens in most cases, unless you're in someplace incredibly remote with very, very poor environmental conditions where there's just no demand at all. But in a large majority of cases, there are people that will benefit from exploiting that land in some way. So those are the kinds of places that we don't want to see roads. But of course, roads are important for people, for societies, for economies. Where are the best places that we want to see roads? So what we want to do is basically say, you know, where are the places where they're going to be most beneficial? Well, the thing that we're focusing on primarily is food demand and food security, because producing food turns out to be overwhelmingly the biggest human land use, okay? We're currently farming an area the size of South America. We're currently grazing an area the size of Africa. Now, current projections suggest that global food demand, because of population growth and because of changing food habits, global food demand is roughly going to double by the year 2050. We've already been through the Green Revolution. We're already producing incredible amounts of food, but we're going to need to double that in order to have enough global food security in order to meet our needs by the middle part of the century. That's kind of a frightening proposition. And one of the scary things is if we're going to have to double food production, what are the environmental impacts going to be? How much more land are we going to need to exploit? You know, how are we going to do this? So if you look at different estimates of how much more land is going to be destroyed, how much more change is going to happen, 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Waiting at me? You're fine.
All around.
Okay, yeah, you're fine.
It's really fun.
Okay, so how much more land is going to be needed? The most widely cited of all the studies is by a very eminent ecologist, David Tillman, and he projects that they're going to need we're going to need about 1 billion hectares of additional farmland. That's an area about the size of Canada. Now there's another estimate which is much, much lower than that, and that's produced by the United Nations Food and Agricultural, FAO, Food and Agricultural Organization, and they estimate, in fact, that we're not going to need an area 1 billion hectares, that we're only going to need an area about 120 or 130 million hectares, much smaller, 12 or 13%, which is only an area about the size of South Africa. So why do we have such wide variation in these numbers? Well, David Tillman assumes we're going to just keep farming the way we've always farmed. Business as usual. Basically, it's just agriculture is going to continue the way that we've been doing it for the last 30 or 40 years. What the FAO, in fact, assumes is that we're not going to farm the way that we used to farm, that in fact we're going to become much, much better and more efficient farmers. And what they're projecting is that what we're going to do is we're going to have better agricultural technologies, we're going to have better crop varieties, we're going to have more fertilizer, we're going to have more irrigation, we're going to do a lot more things to improve the yields, to improve the production in current existing farmlands, okay? So we'll need more land, but we're not going to need as much as if we just keep farming the way we keep doing. And it turns out that one of the key things that's associated with improving agriculture and improving access to fertilizers and improving access to modern farming technologies, and also critically getting your crops to urban markets, which is where farmers are going to get the best prices and where there's very high food demand, is good roads and good infrastructure. So this is where we're arguing we should really be putting our investments in new roads. In new roads and in road improvements is helping farmers to have better access to major urban markets. It's where, so for instance, if you have a good road, you might only be 4 or 5 hours drive away from a substantial sized city, but if you've got bad roads, and we see this all over many places, there's so many potholes, they go 10 kilometers now. So instead of getting there in 4 hours, they need 3 days. It's much, much more expensive for them, and they end up losing 1/3 of their crop to spoilage, okay? Because it just takes so long to get it there. So the economics just don't work out. But if you've got better roads, suddenly you get more rural investment. People see that as a better economic opportunity. People actually start moving into these areas. The land becomes more productive. People living in these rural areas tend to get better access to health services and to educational services. There's a whole set of benefits to rural societies that tend to happen when they've got better road access, okay? So this is where we're really arguing that you're going to get the broadest social and economic benefits to the largest number of people is by focusing road building activity in areas where, particularly areas where you've got underperforming agriculture. So what we try to do here with our analyses is we try to look at the environmental values of an area, and we try to look at the potential benefits of roads or railroads. And so the kinds of things that we focus on, particularly for the road benefits, environmental values are things that you would think about: carbon storage, biodiversity, environmental values. But the road benefits are we're focusing on areas where most of the vegetation's already been cleared because the land's already been settled. It's suitable for farming, but in fact the farming that's going on there is not very productive. There's projected to be large increases in agricultural demand because populations are growing or because export markets are growing. And if you were to put a road in there, you would be able to access urban markets, say within 4 or 6 hours of driving time. If you're in the middle of the Sahara Desert, it doesn't matter. You might have everything else right there, but you're going to be 1,500 kilometers from the nearest city. Even if you get everything else right, you're never going to be cost competitive in that kind of circumstance to an urban market. So you've got to be able to be close enough to a market with a good road in order to try to make it cost competitive. So here's the values that we're actually putting into our models right now. I won't talk about these very much because we don't have much time. We also put in these parameters here around road benefits. And what we then get are maps, and this is a map now for Indonesia and for Malaysia, of the natural values. So if they're darker green, that means you have higher natural values in the environment. And you've got some of the darkest green values in the world here, because you have such high environmental values. If you look at other countries, you wouldn't see nearly this much green. And then what we do is also say, where would you get the most benefits from roading activity, from improving roads or building new roads? And you can see there's substantial areas here in the Asia-Pacific region where you would be getting substantial economic and social benefits to local rural communities, ranging across a whole set of services from food production to better health services, better educational services, and also producing more and cheaper food for your urban populations, which is good for the economy. A lot of good things happening if you put the roads in the right places. And then what we can do is we can overlay those two maps on top of each other, and where you've got higher green values means you've got high environmental values. Where you get higher red values means you're getting more benefits from producing roads, from improving or for producing new roads in terms of food production. And where you get dark areas is where you've got both happening. Now the dark areas are a little bit scary because that says those are the places where we've got high environmental values, but we've also got high potential for improving agriculture. So these are what we call conflict zones, okay? Now, the Asia-Pacific region, you can see here, has got actually a lot of green, because there's a lot of environmentally important areas. It's got quite a lot of red, but it's also got a lot of dark in here. And if you actually look pretty closely, you'll see a lot of dark around these areas. What it says is there's a lot of really important decisions to be made in the near future about road projects, about where they're going to go and what the environmental costs are going to be. And there's some very serious differences between certain road routes or certain project routes and others. Some will have much lower environmental impacts and much higher economic and social benefits than others will. So the final thing I just want to emphasize is we spend a lot of time talking about, we find that in many cases there's this syndrome of investors or sometimes governments coming in and talking about projects and selling them to people, and people in many walks of life are uncritically accepting these projects as being good. And in fact, there are serious and significant potential risks associated with environmental risks, social risks, political risks, economic risks, and it's important to have conversations about these, realistic conversations, so that governments and people are making the right decisions. So we've got the series of these one-pagers that we produce now in Bahasa, Malaysia, Indonesia, PNG Pidgin, and English. If you would like us, we've got some hard copies, but it's easier, just give us your email, give my two colleagues here your email, and we will email you PDFs of these, and we're very happy to distribute these in PNG Malaysian or in English, whatever you prefer. And these, in very simple terms with cartoons and that kind of thing, talk about some of the things that can happen. And this is all based on a lot of research. It's not based on us making it up. It's based on a very heavy-duty research effort that we've made into looking at these environmental effects. So the bottom line, folks, is if you're interested in the environment, if you're interested in human development, if you're interested in playing a role in some of the most important challenges and decisions that have been made, you're living at the right time and you're in the right place. Because right now, you're living in an era of incredible change. The Asia-Pacific region is this epicenter of environmental values. There's enormous potential to make a difference, okay? But I will have to say right now, we've been looking at a number of the projects that are being proposed now for Peninsular Malaysia and for Borneo and other parts of the Asia-Pacific, and I see personally, and I think my colleagues do too, a lot of warning signs, a lot of concerns about some of these projects. And there's probably a really serious need to look critically at some of these and to ask, are the right things being done to reduce the risks and to maximize the benefits? Because it's in everybody's interest in doing that. It's not just from an environmental perspective, it's social, it's economic, it's broad-reaching across all segments of society.
So now Bill's joined by 3 of his colleagues, and I'll just give them a quick introduction, and they've also got amazing CVs as well, but I'm doing the short form. So first we have Dr. Ruben Clemens. So Ruben's a conservation scientist by training and was Bill's first PhD student at James Cook University. So for his PhD, he investigated the environmental and social impacts of roads in Southeast Asia. He currently wears 2 hats. He's an associate professor at University of Malaysia, Terengganu, and the co-founder of the local NGO called Rimba. So next we have Muhammad Alamgir. He's a spatial ecologist. For his PhD, he used spatial modelling to assess the impacts of land use and climate change on natural ecosystems and biodiversity. He also completed his PhD at James Cook University, and currently he's a postdoctoral researcher there, where he's looking at the impacts of roads and infrastructure projects on biodiversity and sustainability in the Asia-Pacific region. And finally, we have Mason Campbell, a plant ecologist and conservation scientist. For his PhD, he investigated the ecological responses of lianas to habitat fragmentation in tropical rainforests of Northeast Asia, and he did his PhD with Bill. And he's currently a postdoctoral research fellow at JCU, where he examines ways to optimise road routes for the benefit of society and the environment. So welcome these guys on stage. And what we'll do, as usual, we'll take 3 questions at a time, and then we'll compile them, and maybe Bill will start, or maybe throw some questions to these guys, whoever's not concentrating. However, yeah, that's right. However, if you guys want to say anything, or maybe we can wait till the Q&A. So why don't you start? We have some questions from the audience. Oh wait, we'll pass the mic around. Maybe introduce yourself first and then ask a question.
Very good evening. My name is Mohammed Azamuddin. First year environmental science, really excited. My question is, what are your comments about wildlife corridors and how, if they have any impact in helping conserve the ecology and environment.
Another question. Okay.
Hi, good evening. Very interesting presentation. You covered so much ground. I'm not really sure what to ask, but I've got so many questions. Perhaps I would like to hear what you all have to say about that issue of zero deforestation and how Malaysia and Indonesia are fighting it, because I mean, you asked whether it is something that's on the radar here, and I must say it's not really discussed much, so I'll be quite interested to hear what the panelists have to say on that. Thank you.
Maybe I'll ask you a question. In terms of all the issues, you brought up a lot of them. One of the interesting things is, you know, the role of these big multinational mining companies who, on paper, they have really good sort of corporate social responsibility charters and even much better than perhaps the governments they're working with. Can you perhaps, is there any way we can harness, you know, these big multinationals to actually do good stuff? Yeah.
All right. Well, since I think we'll have Ruben on the shoulder to talk about wildlife corridors. So that's the topic of his PhD, more or less. So tell us about corridors.
Yeah, very good question. Wildlife corridors are really important, and the Malaysian government has, I don't know if you know, developed this Central Forest Spine Master Plan for ecological linkages. So they looked at all the remaining 4 forest complexes in the Peninsula Malaysia, and they looked at where we can potentially secure forests to link up these 4 complexes. So right now, we're actually working in one of these wildlife corridors in Terengganu. That's where I did my PhD actually, and the government actually built several viaducts or eco-viaducts to try to connect these fragmented forests. And yeah, when I was putting camera traps out there in the forest, we really noticed quite a lot of large mammal species using these corridors to get from Tamanagara to all these log forests up in Terengganu. So this is the Kenya Wildlife Corridor, or one of the primary linkage 7, if you were to have the official name. And so these corridors really do a lot to maintain the gene flow across protected areas, and basically very important habitats for dispersal. And right now we're trying to actually get these corridors protected, because right now they are important corridors on paper, but a lot of these corridors do not actually have protected area status, so they can actually be just cleared just like that and logged. And we find that, at least for large mammals, these wildlife corridors are really important and they should be protected. But for other organisms like small mammals and birds and all the other reptiles, we still need a lot more research to be done. In theory, they are important for dispersal, but students like you, if you want to go out there and do more research in wildlife corridors, there are plenty of them to choose from, but while stocks last.
So the corporate question, I'll just skip this corporate one. Mom, you want to take a shot at that?
The corporate one or
Yeah.
deforestation rate?
No, I'm going to take that one.
You don't get to choose.
You want to take a fun at that one? You Mason can share that if you want.
No, that's okay. About the corporate responsibilities, the issues that is our region is there. They have a lot of corporate responsibility, and in the perspective of some developing countries, yes, they have some agreement with the governments to do these types of mining activities in certain areas. That when you go to look into that type of area, it's not actually happening in only those areas. They're always standing in some other nearby areas. But to show the governments, sometimes they take the corporate responsibility, they give some scholarship to some students, under the agreement of their some responsibility, but in reality, the nearby peoples who are affecting too much from these types of projects, they are getting very, very less benefit from this. And it's also a question about how many percentage of their profit is going to the corporate social responsibility. We always say in the media that most things they do is just to fund some students for higher studies, maybe for masters or something like this. So not that much thing happening in terms of if you think about the percentage of their profit. And when they finish their project, they left from this area, but sometimes even very, very problematic social problems is there. They get married, or even without marriage, they get a couple of children, they left there. So it's a long-term effect on those areas. But what are they doing for this community? Nothing. Yeah, that's it.
Oh, you want to add to that?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Particularly enforcement is often lacking in a lot of developing countries. So it's very well to come in with very nice social and environmental charters, but if you don't have enforcement, then that's often not what occurs on the ground, so the realities aren't met. In addition to enforcement, purchasing power has played a large role recently in conservation in the tropics, things like sustainable palm oil and that, by locals, general populace, deciding that they're no longer going to back products which contribute to deforestation and destruction, basically. So a lot of public purchasing power and public pressure has made a huge difference recently, but also enforcement of social charters and environmental charters that companies say they're actually going to do. Whether it occurs is often due to that enforcement.
And just
Go for
so
it.
I can. And is there a big difference between, you know, maybe like a multinational from Australia, like a BHP, versus maybe a Chinese company where their laws aren't so strong within their own countries, while Australia we have, you know, a lot stronger laws? Do you have anything to say there?
Well, typically what you'll see is multinationals. There's two types of corporations that have tended to be less responsive. One is if they're a local corporation, oftentimes headquartered in a developing country, have been, so for instance, some Chinese corporations have been shown, in fact, in various analyses to have, for instance, being some of the leading drivers of tropical deforestation, and they've been also shown to use other developing countries as what they call pollution traps or pollution havens. So there's been kind of a record of environmental exploitation. The other thing is, in addition to being multinational, if you're is not being private, a public company versus a private company. If you've got a company that's just owned by a very wealthy person, oftentimes they don't care because they don't have shareholders, they don't have a board of stockholders, they can just make decisions. So we've seen some of the biggest, historically some of the biggest environmental sinners have been privately held, powerful corporations. Now I'm just going to say, Mason mentioned a little bit about what you might call carrots, which is the markets. You know, people are trying to buy eco-certified timber, eco-certified palm oil, and that's been powerful. But another thing that's actually been important is the sticks. You know, carrots and sticks and what we've actually found is that this comes back to this issue about the oil palm corporations and the no deforestation agreements. Going back to, I think it was only about 3 years ago, I believe it was Wilmar, the world's biggest oil palm producing corporation, announced a zero deforestation commitment. Now, this meant one of the world's largest landholders said, we are not going to deforest any land, or we're not going to produce or market any oil palm that is being produced on land that has been recently deforested. And then suddenly, now there's been a lot of issues around whether this is really happening, if it's being, the compliance and all that. There's a lot of issues, whether subsidiaries are doing the wrong thing and then selling it to the, so there's a lot of issues. But what has happened is there's been this tidal wave. It's almost become like a politically correct thing where now all the most of the major, not just oil palm, but Nestle, Procter & Gamble, I mean, it's the big food buyers of food products have now also come into this thing about zero deforestation. It's become almost a litmus test. And you've seen companies like Asian Pulp and Paper, which were famously like the environmental bad guy. And they got so blackballed, they became toxic. Nobody wanted to touch them, and they lost huge amounts of their market share. So this is like a stick, right? So the bad companies have been really getting punished. And suddenly, if you're not declaring no deforestation, you're losing market share. And it's not really happening so much because of carrots, it's actually happening because of sticks. And the thing that's really powerful is that like an environmental NGO they'll go to IKEA, and they won't even they'll say, IKEA, we know you're buying timbers from areas that are being deforested in Borneo. If you don't stop that, on Monday we're going to have grandmas and little kids walking around in front of your store saying, the orangutan killers, don't buy furniture from these guys. And it scares the crap out of IKEA. It's amazing how powerful this is. So now we've seen all these no deforestation agreements, and they're starting to actually really cut. And so Indonesia and Malaysia, which are the two biggest oil palm producers in the world, responsible for like 75% of all production, got together, and President Jokowi, Joko Widodo, they call him Jokowi in Indonesia, flew here to Kuala Lumpur and signed with your president an agreement to form the coalition of leading oil palm exporting nations. And they have declared that they're going to outlaw or ban any no deforestation agreements happening within their companies operating in their borders. So this has been a major and overt effort designed to undercut what has probably been the most important factor that's been reducing pressure on forests in the Asia Pacific, and oil palm spreading everywhere now. So wasn't just Asia Pacific. So actively, and I'm amazed you haven't heard about it. So it says something interesting about how the media is operating here, because it's been, go to alert, okay? Just go to that website. We had a big story on it, okay? And we covered it in detail. There's lots of links to the media stories that were covered, evidently not here, but they were sure covered outside of here, and lots and lots of discussion in Europe and North America and Australia and other places about what's going on and why are they trying to do this and what's the justification. So it should be discussed. I mean, people can decide one way or the other, but I'm amazed it's not being debated. It's a huge policy initiative by those two governments.
We have,
Yes, my name is Carl. I'm from Copenhagen Zoo. I've been privileged to follow a lot of your work here on the road issue right from the beginning, and I'm sort of trying to turn and twist the issues, the massive issues you are actually highlighting, and trying to figure out what are the drivers behind it, because I believe maybe that's where the intervention should be. And I don't know if I'm right or not, but I seem to come back to the economic system in the end of the day, that what you are actually trying to advocate for is to be more effective, more prudent, more environmentally friendly, and we actually save a lot of money in that sense, but the great benefit is in soft values in terms of environmental integrity and ecological processes that are maintained and so on. But we do live in a world where the global economic system is based on infinite demand and infinite supplies. And in a fine word, it's always being described as growth. We all need growth and growth and growth. But actually, the roadmap that you're putting out is actually working contrary to growth. And I'm just wondering, I mean, also you mentioned now the new no forest moratorium. Actually, I can say it was debated and is debated a lot in Indonesia, less so here. But that's another example of where actually it's a policy that is meant for growth. A lot of the mega projects you highlight there, that growth engine, so to say. And I wonder if there's any way where some of your models can consider economic factors that would actually demonstrate a form of growth at the same time, even if it goes a little bit counter to the whole idea of it, of actually looking at finite resources. There are a lot of now new sort of resource-based economy, circular economy models and so on. But again, they also go counter to the growth syndrome that the world works on at the moment.
I'm going to take a very quick shot at that, and then I'm going to ask one of my colleagues
We'll
to
wait
add
for
to
the
that.
other two.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go.
Yeah, I apologize for having to do the pre-question thing. It's a very deep question that you've asked, Carl, and it is one, we're looking kind of at the proximate problems, and then you've got the ultimate problems, the ultimate drivers. So population growth, the economic systems, there's a whole set of these ultimate drivers. You put your finger on one of the really critical ultimate ones. It's a big, complicated question, and I'm going to let one of my younger, smarter people attempt to answer that. But I would say this, I actually would say our models are not anti-growth, and we're not anti-development. I'd say we're pro-smart development. There's actually very substantial potential for economic growth and development and food production increases. But really the thing that our models emphasize is trying to make it as more equitable. Because what you tend to get traditionally is wealthier people in cities and very impoverished people in the rural areas, and not enough connection between the two. What this is really trying to do is to even out the economic landscape, provide better flows of benefits food into cities so that food production costs for food become lower, and that helps everybody. But also because the benefits of the cities flow out more readily, and you get more rural investment. And really what it's trying to do is to focus and concentrate development within certain areas where there's already been mostly substantially settled land, and intensify that. And that way, in many ways what you're getting is more intensive production areas, and then that's helping to set aside other areas for conservation. And it's trying to sort of separate the two. But it's not anti-growth. And I would say that, if we came in here with an anti-growth agenda, you're absolutely right. A huge problem I'm going to let these guys grapple with. But if we frankly walked in the door of anybody we're talking to and said we're against growth, we wouldn't have gotten in the door in the first place. We have to talk about pro-smart development, not anti-development. And legitimately, developing countries need, particularly a lot of these rural and more far-flung communities need social and economic development. So the question is how to do that, how to make it more even and more equitable across large segments of society that are kind of being left out. Now, when you guys want to address the fundamental issue of growth in economic growth?
If you carefully look into our road benefit layer, we have few layers. We overlaid one on top of each other. One, we have the productivity, agricultural productivity. That means if we consider to build a road on this area, that would be better for the agricultural productivity because the lands there has the potentiality to increase the agricultural production. And we have another layer there, which depends on the distance to the nearby market. So the thinking of including this layer is because if you have a good production, good agricultural products there, if you can't transport them on time to the nearby market, you are losing money. So we also have that layer in our road benefit layer. So, as Bill said, we are actually in favor of development, but sustainable development. How can you develop at the same time? How can you don't destroy environment?
May I just clarify? I get the point that of course you're not against the development, but what I meant is that a lot of the initiatives in effectivizing things and so on results in financial terms of less money flow, that is less cash flowing around in the system when you compare to a mega project, a mega dam, now we're talking about an East Coast railway here that costs billions and billions of ringgit, for example. That's what I mean. I mean, those kind of projects that bring in a huge amount of cash flow that stimulates whatever. I don't know, I'm not an economist, but that's what you usually hear, and that's very difficult to compete with in an argument, so to say. So that's what I mean. Yeah.
Well, I think our framework would involve some of those projects you could modify, some of those projects you could possibly show that, all those projects that are planned and proposed don't have it. A lot of them have a whole set of factors that can tip them one way or the other. So what we try to do is to have a balanced conversation and realizing that we're dealing with sovereign nations. But I'd say, well, there's one really important macroeconomic principle here, which is that these large-scale projects don't tend to be associated with equitable. In fact, as I mentioned, the Gini index, you tend to get a pot. So what happens is these big projects tend to be very good at enriching segments of the population, but they in fact are not very good at distributing benefits very evenly. And that's the model that we're advocating, is one in which you're going to get more equitable, it's really more efficient use of land, better use of land, more equitable benefits, economic and social benefits of development. These big projects will happen, but we would argue that in some cases they probably shouldn't, or in some cases they should be redesigned. And we haven't talked about it here, but in Africa, for instance, we've looked at some of these huge proposed, there's 53,000 kilometers of new major highways and railroads being proposed there. And we actually looked at and critically compared the cost and benefit of each one of those and said which ones we thought were, good ideas, borderline ideas, and really bad ideas. So it's all about that cost-benefit framework. The bottom line is we live in from an environmental point of view, we live in very dangerous times. And the truth is, we're not going to stop a lot of it. But I think and we're not going to have a chance if we just say, it's only to save the orangutans, and it's to save we've got to talk to a broad audience, because if we don't, we're going to be, the people who really care about that, it's going to make a difference too, but that's 5% of the population. We've got to try to reach that 60, 70% that care more broadly about these issues. I think that's our only chance for affecting change. But you guys want to, anything else you want to say?
I'll just add one thing to that. Often the economic benefits that are proposed by road proponents or other infrastructure proponents aren't adequately assessed in the EIAs for their risks. So for instance, a lot of our work that we've been looking at recently, just a very basic example, is like a lot of these road projects are heavily funded to put in the road, but then there's next to no funding for maintenance. So within less than a decade, many of these massive road projects that are going into developing countries have degraded to the point that they're almost useless. So you have a big influx of economic benefit, but then the cost usually to the government, because the road proponent or developers left by then, are huge to maintain those roads, and that's not factored in. So if you actually weighed for a few of these projects, at least the costs, the realistic economic costs, the benefits would be much smaller than they're saying. So that's for a huge majority of the projects we've been looking at recently.
It's a very important point. One of our key messages is there should be probably less investment initially in big projects, and more money, instead of putting in all the money at the beginning and very little money to maintain, less money in the beginning of the project, fewer projects happening, but more money put in for maintenance to ensure that the projects that are put in retain their value. Because I can't tell you how many roads we've been on that are beautifully built, nice roads, but instead of going 80 kilometers an hour, you go 10, because there's all these potholes, and the land is slumped, there hasn't been adequate base work, adequate culverts, and all these cracks and everything. So you go 10 kilometers an hour on average, and it's a beautifully expensive road. See, again, it's not just, and the governments end up carrying this. They get the money from the World Bank, or from the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or from some other donor or lender, and they still have to pay it back with interest. And yet they've got this huge, it's what's called a stranded asset. They've got this huge asset they've got to pay off, and then they didn't factor in the maintenance costs. And the maintenance cost in wet environments, this is the hardest place in the world to build infrastructure because of water. Water is the enemy of infrastructure. And so it's much more expensive to build and maintain infrastructure here. You can build it cheaply, but if you don't build it right, it's not going to last very long. And we've just driven so many kilometers of this, just probably 2,000 kilometers in Papua. Or sorry, no, actually that's Africa. I mean, that mixed up, probably 500 kilometers in Papua, but you just see so much of this. Non-functional roads.
I just want to add to that, just some of the realities of trying to convince the road department to build a road somewhere else. So last time when I was doing my PhD, I was trying to engage JKR, for example, the road department, the road works department. I was telling them, hey, you shouldn't build a road through here because of the it's a lot of wildlife, for example. But at the end of the day, JKR, for example, they have a budget to spend. So they will spend the budget no matter what. They want to keep their budgets high for next year, the subsequent years. So if you were to tell, that was one of the main challenges of trying to tell governments to build roads smartly. They would just want to spend the money so that they can have still a big department somewhere else. So I mean, but right now we're living, fast forward a few years after my PhD, I think now we have a lot more information from all the research. I think you just got to package it differently and with all the information, use more novel material like videos, for example, and also talk to state governments. And as you as scientists or young scientists out there, or graduate students, and the next stage is to bring this kind of information and to start lobbying with the governments. Because there was only like one of me back in 2011, and I wish I had an army to talk to people in the government. I kind of gave up. But right now, with more information and more young people out there, so road departments, JKR, and the EPU, for example, which we went for a meeting, these are people where we should try to talk to, or bring this information to them. Otherwise, roads will continue to be built, budgets need to be spent. Yeah, so that's just something I add on the local context.
I might just say, if you're young and you're really clever with computers, what we need are these little podcasts, 2-3 minutes, cartoons that tell these stories in a way that anybody can get and they're really clever. They go viral. And my brain's too old to even have any chance of doing this, but if you're a young computer savvy person, this is what we need. Storytellers who can do stuff in lots of languages and with cool, easy to understand cartoons. They would have amazing impacts. So come talk to us if you're into that, because we need that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Hi Bill, yeah, wonderful talk, and I really enjoyed that you told us you're going around to all the governments and you're talking to them and you're informing, what's to come in the future. You have some really cool maps that you showed where it's economically benefit for these governments to put the roads, and where it's really good for the environment to not put the roads. I was wondering if you could share any experiences or implementations based on these maps that the government's going, cool, that's research already done, let's build the roads there. Has that happened with any of this? It'd be cool to share if you could share any of that information.
Probably the place, we worked in the Amazon for a long time before working in this part of the world. So my best stories are from there. But Brazil was putting $40 billion of money into new roads and infrastructure designed to accelerate development in the Amazon. So they had huge new highways and projects cutting right into the heart of the Amazon basin. And we got into this and we realized that nobody had done a systematic analysis. So it's a long story. We spent a year studying this very intensively, and we finally published it in Science. And this was published in 2001, but it went viral before that word viral existed. So it was on our maps, our GIS maps, which showed what the Amazon could look like if all these projects went ahead. Was on headlines all over the world. So it turned into a big thing. I testified before the Brazilian Congress, probably did 200 media interviews in the month after that, a number of public presentations, Portuguese, Spanish, and Brazil, and it really, so that actually changed the conversation in Brazil. And as a consequence, didn't happen right away. We kind of fought a battle for a while, but then the government finally backed down, and there was an interministerial review involving 11 different ministries. They evaluated all the projects. They actually came down and agreed with us, and they recommended that 7, I think, of the most damaging infrastructure projects that we'd identified were canceled. Then there was a giant, they also, you know what governments do, they love to do more research. So they set up this big program called GEOMA, put millions of dollars into that to do more research. And then there was a lot of fighting about the details of these roads. A number of the projects did actually go through, but there were sets of mitigation measures like one of the big highways, there was 11 protected areas that were put in advance of the road itself. And so what those protected areas, they don't tend to completely stop deforestation, but if you have a protected area in advance, when you put a road, you get a lot less deforestation. So that's been really important. So mitigation measures and offset measures. So I think that's probably where we've had the biggest impact, because it actually takes some years for these things to, this project started in the 1st of October. Okay, so everything that you've seen so far has happened since the 1st of October. We've been working on roads for a lot longer than that, but the stories I have mostly to tell would be, and then we're starting to have some traction in Africa, and we're just starting to get some, we've had one big win here in Southeast Asia. What's that? Yeah, well, we've been brought into the President Jakawi's key planning group for Papua. So we partnered with that and with WCS, but all Wildlife Conservation Society. But also, it looks like we played pretty clearly. Looks like we helped to save a gigantic, about 55,000 hectare peat swamp forest in Borneo that a company was illegally putting a giant 8-kilometer canal through. So we hit it on alert really hard, and 2 days later, the Minister of Environment and Forestry announced halt to the project, corporations being investigated, a whole series of things have now happened 48 hours after our blog appeared. And so, I mean, you know, it looks like it happened pretty much as a result of what because we spent 3 hours with that minister, and she was very interested in what we were doing. So we really, and she's tweeted a number of times, thank you, appreciate the encouragement, appreciate, you know, so we kind of got this dialogue going. So I think we actually, in that case, got a win on the board. And it was all illegal. Indonesia's basically said they're going to stop clearing peat swamp forests, and it was an Indonesian company that was just bought by a Chinese company. And so, anyway, when we said, the headline was Chinese company going to kill 1,500 Indonesian, or going to kill 1,500 orangutans in Indonesia. That was kind of the headline, and I don't think Indonesians like the sound of that very much.
So shall we take 2 more questions and then we'll go for refreshments, if there are 2 more questions? And we'll try to get the second, you know that. We'll try to get the second one, if there is another one. Okay.
Hi, I'm Vivian from the University of Nottingham. So just a follow-up on Carl's question and also JB's question. So we are always, especially people in developing countries, we're always in for more growth. And so, for example, road plans for the East Coast Railway, and also maybe road cutting through the Kinabatangan Forest Reserve, which cuts through a lot of wildlife and environmental important areas that you show in the map. So then, how do we, what is the suggestions to convince the government or the departments responsible for this road building networks to, you know, take into consideration this wildlife and environmental important area based on your network? What are the suggestions to convince them to move towards that direction where we don't disrupt so many wildlife, where we are given a situation like a fixed budget, like Ruben has mentioned. Yeah, so what are comments on that?
Okay. And we'll get the last.
All right.
Yeah, sorry, Francis from WCS. I would like some opinion on whether the emphasis, the focus now is on roads, yeah, and what you're looking at. I think what Carl brought up earlier, perhaps the focus can be tweaked a bit because growth is the driver, I would think. It's a greater driver than the roads because the government decides this area is going to be opened up. So it's not the road that's a consideration, it's the area that they want to develop, yeah. So as regards palm oil, Malaysian palm oil now is going for its own certification, Malaysian standard for palm oil. And that particular standard is not a gold standard, it's not like what RSPO is considered to be. This particular standard is of a lower standard. So there could be, there would be, I think, moves to develop certain areas of peat forest. Shallow peat would be under threat now because of this lowering of the standard. So it's actually the growth that's the driver, and the roads are actually part of it, but the main driving force is the growth. And how do we handle that? So you've been able to meet with EPU. EPU is
related to development within the country. Perhaps that would be the intervention area, but I think it also needs more than just intervention at that level, or it needs a more sustained effort at intervention. So a one-off meeting with EPU, yes, they seem to be very open, but how it goes from there, I think that would be, what do you think about that? I think in terms of intervention, I think for me would be, needs a sustained intervention. And not just international, because now Malaysia is reacting to international pressure, and that reaction is in the negative, seems to be in a negative direction. So I think domestic interventions are also very important.
I might try that question and then pass the previous question was about, about the wildlife. You can talk about okay. Well, look, you put your finger on a very difficult issue, and there's no simple answer. I mean, again, if you come to developing countries, or any country, which is a sovereign nation, and you talk, if you flatly say to them, your economic growth strategy is the fundamental part of the problem. I don't disagree that in many cases there's so much emphasis on economic growth that sometimes decisions get taken that I think would be considered highly questionable. The key thing that we try to argue is that actually, even if you look at it in a very cold, hard, cost-benefit framework, in fact, a lot of those decisions, if your goal is growth, they don't actually give you a lot of the things that you want. Or what you do is provoke counter-reactions. Now here's there's so many things this is a conversation you started, we could talk for hours. Let's say, for instance, this eco-certification that Malaysia and Indonesia want to do now, it's pretty much greenwashing. It's not regarded as being, it's like the RSPC, even the RSPO certification is regarded as being more or less, it's far from perfect. But in effect, bringing in a weaker certification is really just designed to, in effect, confuse the consumers by saying, oh, it's eco-certified, oh, well, then it's fine. Well, in fact, the international community will get wise to that very, very quickly, and there could be trade actions and other things, or boycotts and things, which you might inadvertently actually harm some sectors of the economy. The Malaysian might accidentally do that without really intending to do that. So I guess the point is, the bottom line is, developing countries have a legitimate and necessary need to develop economically. And the question is trying to come up with strategies that achieve that whilst having the most sustainable and equitable growth strategies, which what we argue is also the ones that generate the most votes. That actually these are consistent with remaining in office, because they're seen to be, you're basically benefiting voters out there. Okay, so there's a lot of political benefits too. These projects that benefit just a few people and that have a lot of huge environmental costs and generate a lot of potential counter-reactions from different domestic and international sources are more risky. The fundamental thing that you guys are raising, though, which is that how do we change the mindset of governments around this issue of growth, you're going to need somebody smarter than me to address this one, because I can tell you there is a lot, Carl touched on some of this, there's a lot of discussion around these issues of no growth economies, zero growth economies, and there are fundamental issues around that. I mean, what do you do with the capital that the profits? Traditionally what happens is they get put back into investment and growth, and it's going to require some really serious retooling of global machinery. But there isn't really any other option, because we've gotten growth, and what happens? In nature, growth, crash. Growth, crash. This is what humanity's in for if we don't change our system. What we kind of need, what you're advocating, is stable, sustainable growth, and we've not figured out yet how to do that. We don't have a system, a prevailing economic system that does that. So the alternative is this crash, boom, and bust thing. And that, unfortunately, well, I guess what we're trying to do is soften, to a degree, some of that crash, and we've seen far too many boom and bust scenarios in frontiers. Way too many. And they're socially, economically, and environmentally devastating in a lot of cases. So that's the kind of, we're not actually talking magic or complications, we're actually talking pretty hard reality. Anyway.
Cool, thanks, Bill. And maybe we'll just Ruben to finish off.
Yeah.
We shouldn't go too long.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Francis, yeah, the question and talked about one of EPU meeting that Bill had. I think Bill is going to tell me later that, hey Ruben, please follow up with EPU over the next few months. That's something he didn't tell me when he first came here, but I think that's going to be the trajectory, right? So,
That's smart work.
more work for the former PhD student. Yeah. Back to the question, yeah, sometimes, yes, I mean, we can feel helpless, and sometimes there's so many powers. They want to build a road through important wildlife habitats, and we feel powerless sometimes. And sometimes we think, with limited budget, what can we do? Should we write a petition? Should we do a campaign? From my experience, I feel it's best not to be too antagonistic sometimes with this kind of projects. Sure, some NGOs, let them be the ones raising the noise, but if you can, try to maybe find some allies that share the same ideas as you. If you think there's a road project that you want to stop going through an important habitat, or somebody, an ally would probably be like an NGO or maybe a professor, for example. Someone has good connections with the state government, because ultimately the state controls the land they develop. If you can find someone like that that shares the same ideas with you, talk to that person and form a strategy, and just write a letter into the state government, meet somebody important that actually can make a decision regarding that project, and just have a first meeting, first connection, talk about the issues, don't be too antagonistic about it, tell them about the problems that will possibly befall this project or wildlife in the area, and then go from there and see how far you get. But I think your energy and resources will be better spent that way rather than trying to do a campaign and probably let other NGOs or other people make the noise. But if you can be smart about it and talk to the right people to make the change within the government, because ultimately you need to sit down and make them aware about things. Because sometimes state governments, believe me, in the state government where I work with, in the economic planning unit, do not even have an economist. Alright, so that's the problems. That's how bad the situation is. Alright, so you must be aware. A lot of people within the state governments are not aware of a lot of things. So yeah, try to use the approach which I like, which is try to form an alliance, talk to the governments behind the scenes, and I think we are making that progress in that using that model. Not to be too antagonistic, but to come with solutions behind the scenes and talk to them in a nice way.
Thanks, Ruben.